This program was made possible by support from the Surface Navy Association, promoting recognition of the role of the Navy and surface forces in United States security. Learn more at www.navysna.org. The American Civil War. 4 years of carnage, testing whether America was, in fact, one nation, indivisible. While vast armies from north and south remained locked in bloody stalemates across the nation, the United States Navy played a key role in assuring the eventual victory. Victory that preserved the Union and brought freedom for millions of African Americans. This is a story of leadership, technology, strategy, freedom, and the courage and sacrifice of the American sailor. The story of the Civil War at sea. The United States Navy entered the Civil War with a huge task and a limited number of ships, but it was blessed with bold and, some might say, brilliant leadership. It started with the Commander-in-Chief. President Abraham Lincoln had little military experience himself, but as president he had the task of overseeing the military operation against the Confederacy. A big part of that job was making sure the Navy had the tools and men it needed to carry out the mission. On Lincoln's watch, the Navy went from a fleet of 90 ships to 670. Naval expenditures increased tenfold. The number of naval officers increased from 1,300 to 6,700. While Lincoln struggled to find the right leadership for the Army, he had no such problem in the Navy. His selection of Gideon Welles as Secretary of the Navy set the tone. While politics may have played a role in Welles' selection, he was a supportive newspaper editor from Connecticut. The choice turned out to be inspired. Welles had served as the chief of the Bureau of Provisions and Clothing in the Navy Department from 1846 to 1849. That experience gave him a broad understanding of the Navy's needs and how the department worked. Serving under Welles as Assistant Secretary was Gustavus V. Fox, a brilliant naval officer who possessed the experience of several successful commands. In his position, Fox played a role similar to today's Chief of Naval Operations, long before such an office was created. During the Mexican-American War, Fox served in the brig Washington in the squadron of Commodore Matthew Perry. Volunteering for duty before the start of the Civil War, Lincoln gave him command of a steamer to take provisions to Fort Sumter. Arriving just as the garrison surrendered, Fox was able to evacuate the Union personnel. Joseph Smith held the critical post of head of the Bureau of Yards and Docks. His continuous naval service stretching almost a half-century and his long tenure at the post before the start of hostilities more than qualified him to meet the incredible demands the war would place on the U.S. Navy. The Navy was also blessed with a number of other experienced and able flag officers. David Farragut entered naval service as a young man and saw action in the War of 1812. A Southerner in Virginia when the state seceded from the Union, Farragut moved to New York since he believed secession to be treason. With a strong endorsement from fellow officer and adoptive brother David Dixon Porter, Farragut was offered command of the West Gulf Blockading Squadron aboard his flagship USS Hartford. During the war, Farragut, the first naval officer promoted to admiral, captured the key port of New Orleans and earned immortality at Mobile Bay when he was credited with uttering the famous order, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Porter, who previously saw action in the Mexican-American War, also took part in the capture of New Orleans. Promoted to acting rear admiral, he commanded the Mississippi River Squadron, supporting General Grant in the siege of Vicksburg. John Dahlgren headed the Navy's Ordnance Department during the war and designed several innovative guns and cannon. In 1863, He took command of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, and the following year provided naval support for Sherman's capture of Savannah. Samuel DuPont was a career naval officer who distinguished himself in the Mexican War. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Lincoln appointed DuPont to an elite group of naval leaders who developed the blockade strategy. He was the first commander of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, responsible for cutting off the flow of supplies into the rebellious states. While many naval officers with Southern sympathies resigned their commissions and joined the Confederacy, those who remained were determined to preserve the Union. They were fortunate to have the support of a small group of brilliant engineers who advanced naval technology and provided the needed weapons to fight the war. At the beginning of the Civil War, the U.S. Navy fleet consisted of 90 ships. Of these, fewer than half were deemed ready for active service. The rest were in dockyards awaiting various repairs. But while numbers might not have been in the Navy's favor, technology was. Because of foresight and planning, the active ships in the U.S. Navy were a modern and formidable force. The majority were steam-powered and bore the latest improvements. The United States had been among the first of the world powers to grasp the power of steam as an auxiliary power to sail. In the years leading up to Fort Sumter, the U.S. Navy had practically reinvented itself. The outbreak of war unleashed a flurry of shipbuilding, guided by able engineers and designers. During his career, Swedish-born engineer and inventor John Ericsson revolutionized several facets of marine technology. During the Civil War, movements of Ericsson's pencil across his drafting board were as crucial to victory as the movements of the Union Army across battlefields. His first great contribution to the war effort, developed well before the outbreak of the war, was the screw propeller. Until then, steamers relied on paddle wheels for propulsion. In 1842, Ericsson designed USS Princeton, the U.S. Navy's first propeller-driven warship, and the most advanced ship of its time. It was armed with another Ericsson invention, the hoop gun, specially built to carry a larger charge with added safety. Ericsson, however, is best known for his design of USS Monitor, the U.S. Navy's innovative but rather strange-looking ironclad. With most of the ship below the waterline, with only its deck and revolutionary revolving turret exposed to enemy fire, the ship earned the nickname Cheese Box on a Raft. Ericsson launched the ship 30 January 1862, a scant 100 working days after signing the contract with the Navy. Time was of the essence because the Confederate Navy was also working on an ironclad of its own, the CSS Virginia. On 8 March 1862, the Virginia unleashed its deadly fire in Hampton Roads, sinking several wooden warships before its planned attack on blockade ships. But the following day, USS Monitor steamed into Hampton Roads and changed the course of naval history. The two ironclads engaged one another for hours, with shells bouncing harmlessly off one another. At the end of the day, the battle ended in a draw, but it was clear to all observers that the day of the wooden warship was over. Congress recognized Ericsson's vital contribution and passed a resolution praising him for his enterprise, skill, and energy in the construction of the Monitor that so opportunely came to the service of the fleet at Hampton Roads. At about the time Ericsson was developing the Monitor, James Eads, a St. Louis designer and inventor, was working on a shallow draft ironclad that would operate on the Mississippi River. Offered a contract by the Navy, Eads also completed the order in 100 days. 7 ships, collectively known as City-class ironclads, were in service on Western waterways by January 1862, playing a vital role in the control of the Mississippi and its tributaries. Even before the Monitor engaged the Virginia, Eads ironclads were making a difference in the Western theater, taking part in the capture of Fort Henry on the Tennessee River. Eads stayed in constant communication with the commanders of his ships, incorporating their comments and suggestions into improved designs. John Dahlgren was a gifted naval officer, but found his true calling as a designer of weaponry. Assigned to the Washington Navy Yard in 1847, Dahlgren established the Navy's Ordnance Department and quickly became an expert. Dahlgren was a moving force in development of larger, more powerful guns. He pushed the Navy to build its own foundry because at the time there were no other private facilities to produce the needed weaponry. His first gun was the boat howitzer, which was designed to be used both on boats and on landings. He also led development of a cast-iron muzzle-loading cannon known as the Dahlgren gun, perhaps his most significant contribution. By 1856, the Dahlgren gun had become a fixture aboard U.S. Navy warships. His influence on armaments would be felt throughout the war that followed and provide an advantage to the Union Navy. These technological advancements, particularly ironclad ships and the adoption of steam power, would make their impact felt as the Navy carried out its strategy of blockading the southern states and seizing control of the Confederacy's lifeline, the Mississippi River. Though war had long been expected, the fall of Fort Sumter in April 1861 made it a reality. There would be no turning back. On the advice of General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, President Lincoln proposed a plan to cut off southern ports by sea, seize control of interior rivers, and capture major cities. Lincoln signed a proclamation laying out the blueprint for the naval war. Dubbed the Anaconda Plan, the strategy called for Navy ships to blockade every southern port along 3,000 miles of coastline from Virginia to Texas. The objective was to prevent the Confederacy from exporting its cotton to European buyers in exchange for hard currency, and to keep vital supplies such as weapons and blankets from getting in. Blockading this much territory with such a few ships seemed an almost impossible task. This mission impossible fell to the Blockade Strategy Board, also known as the Commission on Conference and the DuPont Board, named for its leader, Captain Samuel Francis DuPont. Besides DuPont, the other members included Commander Charles Henry Davis, Major John Gross Bernard of the U.S. Army, and Alexander D. Bache of the U.S. Coast Survey. The Navy's few ships were augmented by the fast vessels of the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service, the forerunner of the U.S. Coast Guard. The Revenue Cutter Service was ideally suited to this task since one of its principal missions since its founding in 1790 was to stop smugglers. These ships proved particularly adept at intercepting Southern blockade runners. Ultimately, the board's blockade strategy was made possible by the power of steam. Steam allowed ships to move faster, not limited by the wind. The newer ships in the fleet were already steam-powered, and their numbers were rapidly increased in the frenzy of shipbuilding that followed. It was this that enabled the U.S. Navy to post a cordon of pickets at the mouth of every harbor, river, and inlet from Chesapeake Bay to Mexico. With this control of the sea, the commercial operations of all Confederate ports were, for the most part, brought to an end. Steam also helped the Union Navy take control of the barrier islands off the Carolinas and strategic Port Royal. Steam power allowed the Navy ships to remain in constant motion, greatly reducing the effectiveness of Confederate shore batteries. Besides blockading the coast, the Navy was ordered to capture the ports along the Mississippi River, cutting off that vital lifeline. While the Army appeared more focused on the Tennessee River, Assistant Navy Secretary Gustavus V. Fox set his sights on the capture of New Orleans. The fall of New Orleans, he believed, would result in the eventual surrender of all of the other towns along the Mississippi. In a daring move, Flag Officer, soon-to-be Admiral David Farragut, ran his fleet past the forts defending the city. When Farragut's ships arrived at New Orleans, the city surrendered without resistance. The siege at Vicksburg in June 1863 was much more difficult. General Ulysses S. Grant was dug in around the heavily fortified city. Navy ships shelled the city and controlled the Mississippi up and down river. In August 1864, Farragut's forces captured Mobile Bay, and in January 1865, a joint U.S. Army-Navy assault took Fort Fisher, which guarded the approaches to Wilmington. With this victory, the U.S. Navy had fulfilled its mission. While Union and Confederate armies slugged it out across battlefields from Virginia to Mississippi, the U.S. Navy had slowly tightened the noose around the Confederacy. Vicksburg and Port Hudson surrendered as much to Farragut and Porter as to Grant. Sherman's march to the sea was possible in many respects because the Navy held Port Royal. In McClellan's march on Richmond, it was the Navy's guns that provided critical cover. In the final analysis, the effectiveness of the Navy's 4-year blockade of southern ports, more than a single battle or engagement, proved to be a determining factor in the downfall of the Confederacy. It also provided a beacon of hope to an enslaved population on land. When ships of the Union Navy took up blockade positions in southern coastal waters, they served as a symbol of liberty for slaves on land. When word spread that Navy ships were just offshore, groups of slaves fled plantations, commandeered small boats, and made their way to the ships. It presented Union commanders with something of a dilemma. The Fugitive Slave Act required the return of escaped slaves to their masters. Failure to do so could be a violation of federal law. But Union commanders, most of whom were sympathetic to the slaves' plight, quickly found a loophole. The Confederacy was waging war on the Union and was using slave labor to build fortifications and aid the war effort in other ways. Since slaves were considered property, the Union commanders declared them contraband, and thus they would not be returned. But where would they go? Some families were settled on coastal islands under the protection of the U.S. Navy. Others were transported to Union Navy yards where they could find employment. Still others, who wanted more than anything to fight against the Confederacy, got their chance. Navy Secretary Gideon Welles had a severe manpower shortage and needed all available hands. A number of free blacks already served in the ranks, so Welles gave his commanders leeway to employ escaped slaves who wanted to serve.
It is not the policy of this government to invite or encourage this kind of desertion, and yet, under the circumstances, no other course could be adopted without violating every principle of humanity. To return them would be impolitic as well as cruel. You will do well to employ them. Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy, July 22, 1861.
Welles authorized Navy commanders to enlist contrabands and pay them $10 a month, compensation equivalent to Army privates. Welles justified the enlistment by pointing out having slaves remain as refugees strained the ship's resources, and requiring them to work without compensation was nothing more than an extension of the slavery from which they had fled. Though history doesn't record it, Welles may have also received encouragement from the Commander-in-Chief, who often listened to Frederick Douglass, a strong advocate for African Americans in uniform. Notably, Welles authorized his officers to enlist former slaves under the same forms and regulations as apply to other enlistments. Though there were some restrictions placed on their advancement, African American sailors served in racially integrated crews. Photographs from the era show black and white sailors mixing easily on deck, sharing an interracial camaraderie that was almost entirely lacking on land. Army units were strictly segregated, but there were no segregated Navy crews. Besides escaped slaves, a number of free blacks served in the Union Navy. Many were former merchant sailors and provided valuable skills. At one time, an estimated 16% of sailors in the Union Navy were African American. In combat, African American sailors served with great distinction. 7 men: Landsman Aaron Anderson, USS Wyandank; Contraband Robert Blake, USS Marblehead; Landsman William Brown, USS Brooklyn; Landsman Wilson Brown, USS Hartford; Landsman John Lawson, USS Hartford; Engineers Cook James Mifflin, USS Brooklyn; and Seaman Joaquin Peace, USS Kearsarge, were awarded the Medal of Honor for valor under fire. Robert Smalls, perhaps, deserves special note. In 1862, he commandeered a Confederate supply ship in Charleston Harbor and escaped slavery along with his family and a small crew of fellow slaves. A skilled pilot and seaman, Smalls provided valuable information about the waters off South Carolina and Confederate defenses. In addition to heroic deeds carried out on and below decks, thousands of other African American men and women aided the United States Navy in a variety of ways, as informants, spies, pilots, mechanics, nurses, and laundresses. The African American sailor was part of an integrated force of seamen committed to the fight to preserve the Union, and in the case of African Americans, a literal fight for freedom. Their lives aboard ship were much like those of their white counterparts, with whom they had many things in common. They were young, courageous, and on a mission. The Civil War required huge manpower resources, both North and South. In the North, the states were asked to provide thousands of volunteers. When it came to manpower, the Army's huge recruiting needs meant more men went into the Army than the Navy. Fortunately for the Navy, however, those who wanted to serve on the oceans and rivers brought skill and courage to their mission. While naval recruits could come from anywhere, port cities were a prolific source. Young men imbued with a maritime tradition were more likely to enlist in the Navy than the Army. Sailors had to be at least 13 years old and have a parent or guardian's consent if under 18. Sailors could be no older than 33 unless they had a skill, in which case they could be 38. Ideally, a new recruit received several weeks' training aboard a receiving ship. He reported for duty and received a uniform, was given a number for his hammock, and was assigned to a mess. Aboard the receiving ship, the new recruit learned the rudiments of Navy life. He learned to address and respect his officers, petty officers, and shipmates. Hours were spent in various kinds of drills, such as learning to handle sails, rigging, boats, and cutlasses, as well as the procedures for repelling attackers. Because of the Navy's manpower needs, new recruits often spent only a few days aboard the receiving ship before being assigned to action. What they didn't learn during training, they had to learn under fire. Assigned to a ship, the sailor's orders might require him to be part of a gun crew, which maintained and operated batteries. He might belong to the starboard watch and be stationed in the top of the mizzenmast. If he were part of a gun crew, he would be attached to a particular gun and have a specific job. Whatever functions were required to operate the warship, each sailor had a specific role. They knew their responsibilities and worked as a team. Gunboats and monitors had no sails or rigging to attend to, but required other tasks. The growing number of steamships in the fleet required a crew of coal tenders, and the dust and soot from the coal fires meant constant cleaning on deck. In addition to their assigned duties, seamen, landsmen, and boys were instructed in other duties such as steering, knotting and splicing lines, and rowing, in the use of the palm and needle to do sewing, and in bending and reefing sails. Learning these tasks was necessary if the recruit hoped to qualify for promotion to seaman or to become a petty officer. Naval combat was a fierce and terrifying experience, with opposing ships blasting away at one another at close range. Sailors manned their positions during battle, often surrounded by carnage. As ships of the Union Navy enforced the blockade of southern ports and fought bitter battles for control of the Mississippi, It was the courage and skill of the average sailor that in the end turned the tide. American sailors of all races and backgrounds provided the critical margin of victory, often making the ultimate sacrifice. But their commitment to the mission helped preserve the Union. They proved that with the right leadership, the development of cutting-edge technology, a brilliant strategy, and a moral commitment to freedom, there was indeed nothing average about the average sailor who fought and won the Civil War at sea.